Catastrophic bushfires in Australia reignite the debate over climate change, with the government accused of not doing enough. Why was 2019 one of the worst years on record globally for wildfires? And is there the political will to find a solution? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Bah Thibault. Bushfires are common during the summer in Australia, but firefighters are calling this year's conditions catastrophic. At least 8 people have been killed since September, including 2 firefighters who died on Thursday when their truck was hit by a falling tree. With more than 100 fires burning, the government in the most populous state of New South Wales has declared a state of emergency. A heat wave and strong winds are making things worse. Australia recorded its 2 hottest days ever this week, with the average temperature on Wednesday hitting 41.9 degrees Celsius. Our senior meteorologist Rob McKelvey explains what's made the situation so bad.
So why is the fire season so much worse this year? Well, of course, the main cause is the drought, which has been long-lasting. The causes of the drought actually are normal, an Indian Ocean dipole. Now that, unfortunately, though normal, has been made worse. Largely it's been made worse because the whole world is warming, and these higher temperatures tend to make a drought worse. Obviously, more evaporation with higher temperatures. And the consequence of a warming world, thunderstorms, often more vicious. And that, of course, gives you the gusts that we have seen so regularly. So for this particular setup, the climate is generally hotter. All the records you'll notice have been broken by about a degree, which is typical of the gradual warming in Australia over the last 100 years or so. So more evaporation gives you much drier brush, therefore the tinder is there to burn. And once it's started by lightning, by other causes, the violent storms give you much worse winds. They're often on fronts, and there's one driving through at the moment.
While the crisis is triggering debate about climate change, former chiefs of Australia's firefighting services accuse the government of ignoring warnings that bushfires will become more intense in a warming planet. And the Prime Minister has been criticised for taking an overseas holiday. Scott Morrison apologised and promised to return home soon.
Because there have been such horrendous events that has understandably caused a lot of anxiety, and I deeply regret that. And but for all those who are affected by the fires, especially, we deeply regret it.
Of course, it's not just Australia that's seen such ferocious fires. There were more than 1,600 recorded in Europe this year. This satellite imagery shows just how much of the planet was ablaze with wildfires in the last 12 months. In July and August, large parts of the Amazon rainforest were destroyed, burning at a rate not seen in decades. Tens of thousands of hectares of land and hundreds of buildings were burnt when fires swept through California. And we've seen wildfires in Siberia and the Arctic too. More than 100, a sign of warming conditions in one of the coldest places on Earth. Let's bring in our panel now. In Perth, Australia, Peter Newman, Professor of Sustainability at Curtin University. In London, Martin Wooster, Professor and Chairman of Earth Observation Science at King's College London. And in Lund, Sweden, Emmanuel Raju, he's an Associate Professor of Disaster Risk Management at the University of Copenhagen. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Professor Newman, in Perth, how closely can we link the fires in Australia to climate change?
Oh, I think it's no doubt that this is a catastrophic change, not just a gradual thing that's happening. And it's at the point where every scientist all the Bureau of Meteorology, all the experts in the fire sciences, the firefighters themselves are saying, we've never seen anything like this. This is far beyond anything we ever have seen.
Why is that, though? Why do the fires in Australia appear to be worse this year in particular?
Well, there is a thing called the Indian Ocean dipole, which is where the Indian Ocean changes in its energy patterns. And it is all about how much energy is in climate system, which is increasing because of greenhouse. And that dipole is very extreme at the moment. So we've had a year of really hot, drying weather right across the country. And then suddenly from November, we had the fires starting way beyond a normal time. And they've just caught up and kept going. Some fires have been going for 100 days. They can't seem to be able to put them out. So the preparation of the last year dried everything out, including some of the really wet subtropical forests, which don't normally burn for more than one in 100 years at the most. So it's very extreme, and it's predictable based on the way in which the amount of energy going into the climate system is picking off certain parts with very extreme weather.
Martin Wooster in London, what is it exactly that we're experiencing right now? Is it a case that there are more wildfires in the world, or is it rather that they're becoming more intense and more extreme?
Well, for the last, say, 20 years, we've had pretty good information about where fires are on Earth, their timing and their magnitude, basically from Earth orbiting satellites. And if you look at that record, you can see that actually from year to year, fires overall don't change that much. It's just that in certain parts of the planet, there are extremes that can be 10 times or even greater than average. So that's what we're seeing in some places. But overall, the amount of fire is not necessarily massively more this year than it has been in other years. We're just hearing about these extremes, which are obviously very severe.
So what is causing this, Martin? I imagine that the reasons depend on the regions, obviously.
Yes, there's a wide variety of conditions that affect fires in different parts of the planet. And I guess, it's partly climate that we've heard about just now, but also about human activity. So, for example, in Canada, over recent decades, the fire season has typically lengthened, largely due to climate warming, it's believed. And so that allows fires to burn over a greater part of the year. And so burned area in Canada has roughly doubled, they say, in the last perhaps 50 years. And that's largely down to climate, whereas in places like some of the tropics, it's largely down to human activity. So, for example, in the Amazon, we've heard of this severe fire season this year, and probably that is mainly caused by people behaving in different ways, perhaps due to influences from the government or whatever, not climate. So
interesting. Emmanuel, your thoughts? As Martin said there, it's not every weather event that is a direct result of climate change. What other factors do you think the public should realize are responsible for the fires that we've seen escalate this year?
Yeah, I think taking on from Martin, it's extremely important to remember of what is climate, and then there's the human influence in all of this. Like what Martin was saying in what's happening in South America, for example, with the Amazon fires, there's also a lot of information about deforestation, about losing a large part of natural habitats due to development processes. I think it's extremely important to remember that a lot of disasters, a lot of weather extremes also have a huge developmental factor inside it, and a lot of these development processes as well have a huge role to play in how in some of the effects that we're seeing today.
Tell us a bit more about the social and economic and perhaps even political impacts that this is going to have. I imagine we talk increasingly now about climate refugees. That's one of the consequences, isn't it?
Well, I think particularly what there's a huge discussion if you look at the social science of disaster research about who gets impacted, who gets affected the worst. And there is some evidence in showing that a large amount of extreme weather impacts and some of the devastating impacts that we're seeing is in a lot of countries which are primarily poor, that are more vulnerable to disasters, extreme weather events. who's more affected within these countries, a lack of opportunity, lack of sort of social and economic opportunity as well. So how all of these factors do play a role in sort of determining who's impacted and who's worst affected by disasters and extreme weather. We will continue to see, I think, a large number of people coming out, raising their voices. I think in the last couple of years, we've seen young people taking to the streets. We saw that even in COP25 in Madrid, which happened recently. But I think that what we really need to go more into is also trying to garner more political will and attention around this issue.
And speaking of the political will, Peter Newman in Perth, Australia's government and Australia's political leaders have come under a lot of criticism for what's being described as their inadequate climate policies. What are these policies precisely right now? Is the Australian government doing enough, in your view, to help stem the rise in global temperatures?
No, they're not doing nearly enough. And I must admit, I was very ashamed to be an Australian after the Madrid conference when Australia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil and America basically worked to undermine the global agreement that was coming through there. And our government basically doesn't want anything to change. And they are trying to say that we'll keep up with the Paris Agreement, but they're never going to get close to it. And that they really have no programs in place to really do anything.
Right now, I think Australia's target is a 26 to 28% reduction in emissions by 2030. And Australia, of course, is the world's largest coal exporter, which is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Is that sufficient? Is that target sufficient? And are they on track to do it?
No, they're not on track. Even their own data is showing that, and there was quite a bit happening starting 10 years ago or so, and it's really petered out. But Australian business and Australian householders are doing quite a lot. There's a lot of solar being put on top of rooftops and so on, but there's really no help from the government. And so it's not going to make it. And I do think they have to get serious. The one good thing about these bushfires is it's really woken up the politics of climate change. It was an issue in the last election, but it didn't really raise its head enough to change votes. And I think it would now. And the Prime Minister has got that message very strongly in recent days.
Martin, Peter said there the one good thing about these bushfires, and I know that not all fires are bad, of course. I mean, we're talking about these bushfires in Australia, but they're not all that bad. Explain that to our viewers, if you can, please.
That's right. I mean, fire is a natural process in the environment, and in fact, many ecosystems like the boreal forest, for example, or the African savannas, they've actually evolved to have fire as part of their natural ecosystem function. So if you excluded fire from those ecosystems, it wouldn't be a good thing. And it is the case that there are many places on Earth that have very regular fires that we don't really hear much about because they're not negatively impacting human populations or infrastructure or whatever. So fire is not a totally negative thing. Obviously, we hear about the most extreme events that are, perhaps unwanted. But in many environments on Earth, fire is a natural process.
Right.
And actually, if you exclude fire, you will damage the ecosystem. And in fact, what you will end up with is probably more intense fires because you have a buildup of dead fuel around that in the end will burn and the fire will be worse.
So do you think it's going to get worse then?
Yeah, fire is not all bad.
Do you think for the countries that are negatively impacted, is it going to get worse in the years to come?
Well, I think as we've been talking about, under some future climate scenarios, certain places will see increased risk of fire. I mean, even here in the UK where I am, there are climate scenarios that suggest the southeast of England is going to get more fire prone, basically, because of climate change. So certainly some regions are likely, I guess, to experience worse fire situations because of climate change, yes.
Right.
But also, as I say before, human activity has a lot to do with it.
Right, indeed. So I'll come back to you to discuss, the political will, whether it's there or whether more should be done. Let me just bring in Emmanuel into the conversation once again. Emmanuel, you started talking about this a short while ago, the public opinion about the climate crisis. Do you find that it's moving? In some parts of the world, like the US, for instance, there still seems to be resistance to decisive and comprehensive action on climate change. Do you find that, with the protests that we've had around the world, with people like Greta Thunberg, that the public opinion is changing?
Well, it's changing, but I think it's still rather slow. I think one thing is public opinion, but there's also an important part of political opinion, because a lot of decisions need to be made in those power halls, and it's important, how does this public opinion, how do these voices, how do social movements, collective action, how does this reach those halls of power? And I mean, at COP in Madrid, I think there was a lot of frustration about whether or not what will be agreed on. There was a lot of things that really didn't go the way things should have gone. But there was a slight hope because there was a lot of voice, there was a lot of young people there, there was a lot of university, academia, scientific involvement. So I think we're still divided in that space, and let's also not forget that people in many countries have been fighting climate, have been fighting disasters for a long period of time, have been talking about the environment for a long period of time. So this is, I think the scale at which it's happening is probably different today. But I think people in many parts of the world have been talking about this for a long period of time.
Right. Professor Newman, the 2019 UN framework on Convention on Climate Change was a letdown for many people, as we've heard here. What do you think individuals, communities and governments can do? How can they better plan for this new reality and adapt to the continually changing conditions?
Well, there's a lot they can do. It's there are many things that are now very straightforward that we can see. The work I'm doing in the IPCC is about transport, and it's very clear that electric vehicles are the next big thing. So solar is now by far the cheapest option in producing power, and that needs to spread very quickly and is spreading. But then electric vehicles need to be tapped into that. Heavy transport is harder. Shipping and aviation are doing almost nothing, big trucks and so on. So we've got a lot of research that still needs to be done about what is the solution for them. We do know a lot of things that we can now do very quickly, but there are some that remain a major issue. So we've got to get on with it at the research level, at the trial and demonstration level, but also just at the household level and businesses getting into energy efficiency and putting solar on rooftops and getting on with the business of electrifying their transport systems.
All right. Martin Wooster, what do you think countries can do to be better prepared to tackle these wildfires? Of course, some countries have better means than others, but how can they prevent them if there's a way?
Well, I think a lot of it is about how you manage land, and the policy, for example, of complete fire suppression, putting out every fire that starts, is ultimately probably going to be defeated, because you will end up getting a fire that you can't put out, and because you've suppressed everything beforehand, the amount of material there to burn will be far greater. The fires will be more intense and more difficult to tackle. So it's about managing the land in an appropriate way for your environment, and that might mean even applying fire to landscapes at certain times of year in a controlled manner, so you reduce the amount of fuel that is available for uncontrolled wildfires to burn, that kind of thing. So, but obviously it needs to be appropriate to the environment. And I think also another thing to point out is that we hear about tragedies where people are dying in wildfires, and obviously this is a terrible tragedy. but there probably is maybe hundreds or something a year of that, whereas there may be hundreds of thousands dying early deaths from air pollution related to wildfires. These are the kind of estimates that are being made. So while we hear a lot about the potential climate impacts of fire or the impacts of climate on fire, it's also important to consider the air quality impacts, which directly affect human health.
Right. Peter Newman, Martin talked about land management there a short while ago. Some in the Australian government have indeed blamed land management for the disaster, which is true to a certain extent, isn't it?
Yes, it is to a certain extent, but what they're suggesting is that we need to go in and be burning off regularly to keep the brush down. But there's been quite a bit of science done on this, and these fires that have swept through would not have been stopped. The areas that have been burnt were cleaned up in the same way. It did not prevent these bushfires. So these are far beyond anything that the fire management processes could have fixed. So I do think that there's a limit to how much that kind of management can do when you get these very extreme events coming through. The eucalyptus is like a flamethrower. It can throw fires a kilometre away, and it just is extraordinary to see how fast it can move, and there's nothing can stop it. So we have a genuinely bigger issue, I think, to deal with than just changing simple land management. We've really got a major climate change issue, and adapting to that. There's going to be a wholesale change of where people live. There's a lot of people living in the bush who are going to be too scared to in future. We're going to see some major changes.
All right. Emmanuel Raju in Lund, I think I'll give you the last word. What do you see as the solution for dealing with these disasters, whether it's in developed countries like Australia or other parts of the world that are less developed and that are also affected? How do we, deal with this crisis?
I think, particularly coming out from COP25, there's a lot of blame game that's going on at the moment. The question is, can we sort of move in the direction of solutions? There is hope. Yes, we're taking small baby steps, but I think every time we do that, we go behind and fall back. We don't really reach conclusions, and the negotiations don't go very, very much ahead. It is going to be hard. No doubt it's going to be hard, but it is possible. However, I think it's for countries to sit together to actually come to really hard decisions, raise ambition, like I think which is what was a major take-home message from COP25. We really, really want to see countries take major decisions and raise ambitions in that direction. We need more risk-informed development. I think we really have to turn the cycle from looking at it from stopping disaster risk creation in the future. And there was very little hope at COP25, but I do think that we see a lot of young people. I think that's the hope. It's sometimes, I think the young people were telling the governments, listen to the science, and I do wish that is taken more seriously.
All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for a very interesting discussion. Peter Newman, Martin Wooster, and Emmanuel Raju. Thank you once again for being on Inside Story. And thank you for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly Bah Thibault, and the whole team here on Inside Story, thanks for watching. Bye for now.